for waiting. Who knows about these things, but we're up. And this is a program that the event at the library, or we're commemorating today, something to do with national parks or the outdoors or what have you. And this goes back to the very first national recreation trail, so named in 1968. It is the Appalachian Trail, or as they say throughout the mountains, Appalachian Trail. And it is one of my oldest, well, it is my oldest program. I did this a long time ago, and that means that this program will have some perspective. I'll show you some trail celebrities that if you hiked the trail in recent years, you wouldn't have seen, but I met them along the way. And the trail has had some changes in recent years. Mainly the numbers have been enormous. And now they're trying to cut down the numbers a little bit. But when I went, that really wasn't a problem. So I'll mention things the way they've changed along the way and the way they were when I hiked it. And I'll go ahead and tell you how long ago it was I did this. You probably noticed, as one young guy said, I'm an elderly gentleman. Well, it was 42 years ago I hiked this trail, 1980. And it was the very first year that as many as 100 people in a single year completed the trail. Now they get 2,000 people a year. COVID kind of changed that, but it's really become a much more popular thing, probably because of the Bill Bryson book, but everybody is aware of this trail. Now, if you really know about the trail, you know that the numbers on this map aren't exactly right. In fact, you'll almost never see one of these maps with the correct mileage. When I hiked it in 1980, it was thought to be 2,106 miles. The most recent mileage that I've read, the one that they're giving out now, 2,192 miles. So I can be glad that I hiked it when I did. It saved me a couple of days of hiking there. Anyway, the trail you can see on the right hand side, heading up along the East Coast, goes through 14 states, 7 national forests, 2 national parks, and many dozens of state and local parks along the way. And hiking it really is a big adventure for people. When you talk about hiking over 2,000 miles, you're in for an adventure, whether you want one or not. There's going to be plenty out there. All right, you can start the trail at either end. Traditionally, it starts in the south, Springer Mountain in Georgia, and heads up to the highest mountain in the state of Maine, Mount Katahdin. You can hike it south to north. You can hike it north to south. You can go out over a period of years and say hike for 3 or 4 weeks each summer. Say if you're a teacher, you got a little time in the summer, you could go do a little bit more each year. Some people, you're kind of confined by the weather. You want to get to Maine before the winter snows roll in. So when people hike south to north, they need to beat a weather deadline, roughly October 1st. But if they find themselves running late, when they get halfway up, they could take a bus up to Maine and then start hiking south and extend the season. Anyway, there are as many as 4 million people a year hike some portion of the Appalachian Trail. Most of those are in the state and local parks, the national forests. On a typical day out on the trail in between those places, you may not see anybody on a given day. But if you hike from the parking lot on Klingman's Dome up to the observation deck, you're on the AT. So if you've done that, you can say you've hiked at least that much of the AT. All right, we'll move on here. If you're going to be in for one of these hikes, you're going to need a backpack, whether you like it or not. And backpacks change through the years in different styles, internal frames, external frames. But it is like putting an anchor on your back to drag up over the mountains for a summer. I spent 140 days on this trip, 140 nights of camping. And well, you carry what you need until you can resupply. In your pack, you'll have certainly a sleeping bag. Today, you're more like, well, even when I did it, you're probably going to carry a tent. I didn't. I carried a nylon tarp because I just didn't want to carry stuff. Didn't carry a camp stove, didn't have a sleeping bag pad or any of that. But people carry those things, extra clothing, rain gear. They've got their cooking stove. They've got whatever food they can carry, as much water as they can carry. They've got guidebooks and maps to help them follow the trail. And the trend in modern times is to keep those packs as light as possible, down to 25 or 30 pounds, which is where I was. I was a little ahead of my time on some of these things. I thought, hey, every pound per mile that you carry for 2,000 miles is a ton by the time you get to Maine. Why carry anything that you don't absolutely need? So you can get by with smaller packs than these, but I also saw people carrying 60 and 70 pounds in packs, and I could do nothing but feel sorry for those folks. Sounds like a miserable trip. I've always said the thing I don't like about backpacking is backpacking. Once you put a pack on your back, whatever the weight it is, it turns a nice day's walk into drudgery at times. But you'll see some nice scenery, and if you want to follow the trail, this is Springer Mountain in Georgia. There's the AT headed north towards Maine, and it looks just like a footpath you'd have in the forest preserves, except that it is one of the world's longest continuously marked recreational footpaths, and it was designated a National Scenic Trail, the first of our American scenic trails, in 1968. And what I want you to notice in the picture, right in the middle out here, that the white blaze on that tree, it's white paint 2 inches by 6 inches. You'll see that on a tree or a rock or a fence post, every number of, at least every 100 yards, for nearly 2,200 miles now. And you can pretty well figure, if you walked a couple miles and you haven't seen a white blaze, chances are you're on the wrong path. And that happens to everybody at some point, because you get on tops of some of these mountains and you'll have some trails that cross, say in the Smokies, and it may not be marked clearly, or maybe somebody used the sign for firewood, and well, you think you're on the AT, and when you go a mile or so and realize you haven't seen a sign, you figure it out and walk back. Over the course of a 2,200 mile trek, a wrong turn once in a while, an extra mile or two here or there, it doesn't sound like much, but on the day that it happens, you think it's going to kill you, because you kind of geared your mind to get 20 miles that day, and all of a sudden you walked a mile off and a mile back, and it's 22 miles, and there's always this anxiety that you're still on the trail and you're making good progress. You'll see the trail that looks many different ways at different places along the route. It can look like this on a misty morning down in the woods in Georgia. You could have a nice springtime ridge walk through the hills of North Carolina. Sometimes you're down in the jungle fighting it out with the bushes and the briars. And honestly, you spend a lot of time down in the jungle fighting it out with the bushes and the briars. But the woods will open up here and there. This is at some point in Connecticut where the woods opened a little. And it opens up a great deal as you get near the tops of some of the mountains along the way. This is a place called Charlie's Bunion in the Great Smokies. You can do it in a day hike. You can park and walk back there if you want to, but it's kind of a landmark along the trail. And you might be aware there are a lot of interesting names in the Southern Appalachians. This place is not far from a mountain called Chunky Gal Mountain, which in turn is not far from a place called Pickens Nose. So you'll find some interesting names along the way. And you'll also have some pretty fine views. This is a view from Mount Washington in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It's 6,200 and some feet. It is the second highest point along the Appalachian Trail. Clingman's Dome is actually the highest point. But this is, Mount Washington is always considered a challenge because you get some bad weather in there, and rarely do you get a view like I had that morning. It was a 90-mile view to the horizon, and those are not lakes in the distance we're looking down upon, those are clouds. So even though the Eastern Mountains are no match for the Rockies elevation-wise, well, in New England, you're above tree line at 4,500 feet. So you can be up on top of the world and have some spectacular views, even in the Eastern Mountains. The trail sometimes takes back roads once in a while. Mostly this trail, it's been cut for the purpose of this end-to-end hike. they try to keep into the woods and in the wilderness as much as they can, but there are a few places where, well, you just can't quite be out in the wilderness all the time. You're on the East Coast after all. So once in a while, you'll find yourself on a back road like this one in Tennessee. And that will still minimize your contact with cars and trucks and buses and people and civilization in general. It is 99% of it is just footpath. It's been cut for the sake of the AT. And sometimes that trail looks very, very nice. It looks particularly nice when you're at home planning your trip. You'll think to yourself, golly, won't that be a pleasant stroll through the woods? Only when you get out there, you might find it's 106 degrees, as it was one day in Southern Virginia. It was over 90 basically every day in July and into August. And on days like that, you spend your whole time sweating and trying to get your breath in that stifling humidity while the mosquitoes are chasing you down the trail and the deer flies are zapping you in the head. Sometimes you'd like to be almost any place but in those woods that look so nice in a picture. It is a walking path, but there are a few places where hikers will have to scramble on all fours. You don't have to, there's no real mountain climbing, but you'll find yourself on scrambling over some big boulders like these once in a while. And if it's not the big boulders underfoot, it's the smaller ones. This is a picture of what turned out to be typical trail in the state of Pennsylvania, which was basically a rock pile all the way through for 350 miles or whatever it is. And well, you have to be very careful about picking your path through there because you could turn your ankle or break it about anywhere, hurt your leg. People have knee problems, all these things that occur. So it's kind of slow going through some of this rocky territory in Pennsylvania and some other places too. Weeds grow up along the trail. The trail in the Forest Service and in the national parks, the Forest Service and the national parks do the majority of the keeping the trail cleared of weeds and things like that. But there are volunteer hiking clubs along the entire length of the trail who are responsible for other sections out there. And you know how volunteerism works. Sometimes people really do a great job and then sometimes it slips a little bit. And it seems like whenever you head into a trail like this, you're surrounded by stinging nettles and blackberry briars and perhaps poison ivy. You do have to cross hundreds, if not thousands of streams along the way. Usually you don't have to wade across a stream like this one in Virginia. There's usually a better way to get across. There might even be a footbridge for the sake of the trail. If not, maybe there's a fallen log that's convenient. Or you'll do as people did on this, crossing this stream in the state of Maine, find some conveniently placed rocks and rock hop across. But that's another one of those things. It's easier to say than to do because people forget they're carrying 30 or 40 pounds in their pack and they think they're going to hop very easily to that next rock. Doesn't always work out that way. The trail crosses the major rivers of the East Coast. It crosses the James and the Potomac, the Susquehanna and the Delaware, the Hudson, the Connecticut. This is the French Broad River in North Carolina. And the good thing here is you don't have to swim across rivers or attempt to wade them. They'll usually route the trail right across a road bridge so you can walk across without any real problem. There is a river though in the state of Maine called the Kennebec. There's not a bridge there. And for most of the life of the AT, which has been around since the 1930s, it has been a tradition to wade the Kennebec River, which is very possible because it's usually only a couple of feet deep. Most hikers will carry a pole in either hand to brace themselves as they cross the Kennebec. There are strong currents, slippery around river rocks and the like. And well, you kind of don't want to go across alone in case something happens. I paired up with a guy from the Philadelphia area to go across, but we had no problems at all. But there are many, many stories of all the problems that people have had crossing Kennebec through the years. There used to be a dam upstream and they'd let water out without warning. So hikers would be wading across the Kennebec. The water would be, knee deep when they start across. But by the time you get to the other side, it's water's up to their necks. Their packs are floating away. Their friends are floating away. the situation could be a little desperate at times. They also used to float logs down this river. So you can imagine how dangerous that would be if you didn't know those logs were coming through. Well, because of these possible dangers of the Kennebec, officially they provide a ferry for the hikers to ride across. And that's a guy with a motorboat. That's an elegant term for a guy with a motorboat who will take you across. So the crossing is easier than it used to be, but I would suspect there's still a lot of people who do it the traditional way. But that is one river that is a bit of a problem. So much so that in the mid 1980s, there was a gal who'd hiked all the way up from Georgia and drowned crossing the Kennebec, which is why they've changed the old tradition and provide a service so that people don't have to take any risk crossing the Kennebec. This is the Nolichucky River in Tennessee that had to be crossed. But what I want you to notice in this picture is not the river, but the mountains. That's what this trail is all about. It tries to follow the crest of the Appalachian Mountains all the way from Georgia to Maine. And you may already be aware there is no such thing as a single crest of the Appalachians. It's a series of different ridges. So what they do with this trail is they route it up every mountain they can find and call that the crest of the Appalachians. And the result is there's no such thing as level walking. We're all from Illinois. We know what flatlands look like. That's not what this trail is about. And one of the reasons the mileage keeps changing, well, in hilly territory, sometimes there's erosion damage by the trail, so they want to reroute the trail. Maybe somebody's built, maybe some farmer's not friendly to hikers coming past his property, so he asks for a reroute away from his property. There could be a lot of reasons for reroutes, but it seems like every time they reroute the trail, they make it longer. So yeah, I'm glad I did it when it was 2,106 miles instead of 2,192. And I would guess if they were just to give the best guess today, it's probably 2,200 or more. And it's up and down every step of the way. But mountains are the big appeal, one of the big appeals. And if you were to ask my favorite mountain areas, I would name several. One would be the Great Smokies. They are stupendously beautiful mountains. And yeah, they really do look smoky off in the distance. And if you haven't yet made that trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it's just a day's drive away. It's that near. And you should get there sometime. They're just beautiful mountains. And they're lived in mountains. There's culture, all that, scenery, nature, a lot of good things about these mountains, not just the Smokies, all of them. Another favorite area was the Shenandoahs. That's where Shenandoah National Park is located. If you were to just go do a week of walking someplace, this would be a good place to go. The trail is better graded there than it is in the Smokies. And down in the south, that trail sometimes goes straight up and straight down, not a lot of switchbacks. In the Shenandoahs, a lot of switchbacks, and the elevations aren't quite as high. The only problem in the national parks is you're just going to be dealing with a whole lot more hikers and competition for camping space and that sort of thing. But that's a good place to go. I also enjoyed the Green Mountains of Vermont. When I walked through there in August, they were indeed the Green Mountains. If I'd have gotten through there a little bit later, I'd had those fall colors for which Vermont is known. But if I'd have been any later than I was, I probably would not have made it through the snows to get up to Katahdin at the end of the year. So I'm glad they were still the Green Mountains when I walked through there. I also enjoyed the White Mountains of New Hampshire, which look a lot more like Western mountains. If they're steep and rocky and jagged and not at all as friendly looking as those older rounded tree covered Southern Appalachians. Now I should tell you, it's called the Presidential Range through there. And in the early days of the hike, you're meeting people from all over everywhere. And I met some fellows from New England, and they said, "Oh boy, you want to be ready when you hit the Presidential Range." Well, I'd never heard of the Presidential Range, and I thought, how big could those be? What problems could those be? little states, little mountains, what's the deal? Well, you get there and you realize, yeah, these are pretty significant. And I was really cruising in the latter stages of this trip. Um, it wasn't anything to average 20, 25 miles a day. But when I got to the White Mountains and the presidential range, it was maybe down to 15 miles a day and working for that. So they are significant mountains. But most of the time on this trail, you're not looking at these big, wide panoramic views from the tops of mountains. Most of the time, you're climbing up to those views or down from them. And mostly what you're looking at is just trail, mile after mile after mile of trail. 10 miles of trail, that's pretty good. 100 miles of trail, fine. 1,000 miles, well, that's kind of a milestone. But when you get over 2,000 miles of trail, that it gets a little bit monotonous, especially when all you're really looking at is your feet in many cases. I'll explain the shoe wear in a little bit, but the reason people are watching their feet on this trail is you do go over a lot of rocky and ruddy trail or slippery, muddy trail in places. You could turn your ankle or break it about any place. And they say that it takes about 5 million steps to hike from Georgia to Maine. And that leaves a lot of room for looking at your feet. I mentioned I was a little ahead of myself in a lot of ways on this. Back in 1980, we didn't yet have all the nice lightweight hiking boots that are available today, which I certainly wear today. At the time, your choice was heavy leather hiking boots, which I'd always hated because when they get wet, they're real heavy. You have to break them in or you're going to get terrible blisters. Sometimes you'll need a cobbler to put the sole back on or what have you. The other thing you could do was wear sneakers. And that's what I did because whatever sports I played, quickness and lightness or whatever was always an advantage to me. And I didn't want to make it harder for myself on the trail than I had to. I wore Jack Purcell tennis shoes and I'd get about 800 miles per pair. There is a price you pay for wearing sneakers. One is that there were only 3 of us who did that year. And one of them was referred to as Weird Harold. I don't know what they referred to the other, and I don't know how they referred to me, but it was thought odd to go lightweight. And the truth is here that you really should have more of a sole under your foot when you're hiking and you've got to pack with a lot of supplies. That's all that weight is pressing down in your feet every time you're stepping on these rocks. And my feet were stone bruised to the point that for about 6 weeks, until about 6 weeks after the trail, I couldn't walk in the mornings without putting my shoes on. I mean, just to get up in bare feet and walk across the floor or something couldn't be done. I had to get my shoes on, and then I had a little cushion for all the stone bruising. But it was lightweight. When they got wet, they dry out. It took no breaking in. One of those guys from New England that I met early in the trip, I watched him literally pour blood out of his boot one day. And you can't go on if the boots are tearing up your feet in that manner. You've got to pull off and heal and maybe start again or just go home. But I never had any problems like that by wearing these stupid sneakers. Well, if you look up from your feet at trailside, you might see a few things of interest in the way of plant life, the Virginia creeper pictured here. Of course, our good friends, the poison ivy family, can be found many places along the trail, and there are places where you'll walk through large beds of it. And people ask me, well, what do you do if you're the kind of person that gets poison ivy? And I said, well, you're going to get poison ivy. And I did hear of people who would have to pull off the trail at a trail town to look up a doctor and get injected with some antihistamines or something to get them past the poison ivy. But yeah, if you get it, you're going to get it. And I think I've outgrown that. I didn't get any poison ivy that summer, but you do walk through some large beds of it. And you should put on long pants at the very least when you go through there, but it's so hot that everybody just wore shorts through there and took their chances, and it worked out fine for me, but not for everyone. If you want to snack along the way in the course of your day's hike, There's a lot of good snacking there in the mountains. You've got raspberries and blackberries and blueberries, currant berries, wild strawberries. Um, what else out there? Anyway, there's good nibbling out there. And while you're looking for things to nibble on, you'll see if you're interested in flowers, wildflowers, you'll see hundreds of varieties. Indian paintbrush, trillium, bluets pictured here in North Carolina. The flowering shrubs are out there, the rhododendron, the azalea, and the mountain laurel pictured here. It's the state flower of Pennsylvania and several other states. And you're going to startle up a few critters along the way. And I have to admit, this is one that's not one of your more exciting critters, but it's one that the hikers felt a lot in common with. There were days, well, he was carrying his home on his back as I was, and there were days when I wondered who would get to Maine first. There are more exciting reptiles out there. You may well encounter a rattlesnake or two along the way. I only saw the one in the course of the trip. Other hikers seem to see more, but I had the impression that some of these were city folks. Every snake they saw to them was a rattlesnake. I have honestly never heard of a hiker being bitten on the AT by a rattlesnake, but they're out there, so that is possible. If you're a bird watcher, well, you can do a little bird watching. Again, lots of varieties. As you're hiking in the course of the day, you'll hear woodpeckers in the distance. At night, you'll hear owls. And each day you'll startle up grouse and wild turkeys along the way. And of course, a lot of mammals are out there, including the white-tailed deer, state mammal for the state of Illinois and for a lot of other states. The white-tailed deer were so thick on Klingman's Dome the day that I tried to take this picture trail that the deer wandered right in the middle of the picture and ruined everything. The large members of the deer family, the moose, can be found in the state of Maine, and you can't believe how big a moose is until you see one up close. They're really enormous, imposing animals. When hikers get through Maine in September usually, it's rutting season for the moose, and they're kind of nearsighted. So there's some people have had some interesting experiences with amorous moose along the trail. Just one more thing to watch out for. But the most talked about animal along the course of the trail is the black bear. And it's not just one black bear, it's one and all the others that are out there as well. Black bears are really pretty shy. They don't like to mess with people, but they have learned that backpackers are carrying food in their packs and they'd like to get that food. And I don't know if this ever really happened, but this is the kind of advice you'd get from people along the way, that if a bear charges at you, it's going to be a false charge. You know, your natural tendency would be to drop your pack and run if you've got a bear coming at you. But they'd say, oh, it's going to be a false charge. You should just hold your ground. And once the bear realizes you're not moving, he'll veer off into the woods. That's what we were told. So far as I know, everyone who had a bear coming at him dropped his pack and ran. I only saw one bear in the course of the whole hike. That was in the Great Smokies. And I've been cautioned about that one. So I wasn't caught by surprise. There are a couple other hikers coming down from the north that morning. It said there was a nutty bear up around whatever shelter it was. And so when I got there, I kind of peeked around the corner and saw him or her, and then he or she saw me. And I was so frightening, the bear ran away. Really, the most common living companion that hikers have in this trail is the tree life. All day, every day, you are surrounded by trees in front of you, trees on either side, they're above you, they're behind you. The trail has been described as a long green tunnel through the woods. And you really do see the woods from the inside out. And that seems like a very nice thing, but down in the south, it's a little bit frustrating. All those mountains, well, most of them are tree covered in the south. So down in the valley, you're not going to have a view. You spend a half a day getting to the top of a 5,000-foot mountain expecting to have a nice view, and all you have is just more woods closing in around you. So you kind of have to get used to the tree life along the way. So you could have a hardwood forest like this one in North Carolina. Reach New England, you'll have birch forests. nice change of pace. And then you reach Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and you'll have pine forests. And to illustrate the point that I made before, this is one of those spectacular views, this time from the top of a 5,000-foot mountain in Vermont. Again, no view, just more trees. A lot of color comes to the trail when autumn rolls around, such that you can look out over Rainbow Lake in Maine and understand why it was called that. Even though the sun wasn't shining, you can see the color in the trees. The best part of a view like this for a hiker was not the color in the trees or the sunshine, if there was any sunshine to enjoy that day. It's the water. All day, every day, you're worried about where will your next supply of drinking water come from. And you could use filters and so forth and use water out of a pond of this size. But if it gets to be, well, it's not a good practice. It's better to find springs along the way, just ice cold springs like this one, ice cold clean water bubbling up out of the ground. This is Story Spring in Vermont, and what a treat it is on a hot day to reach a nice spring like this. You fill up your water bottles and really enjoy. Water is the heaviest thing that you can carry, so you can only carry so much, and you know you're going to have to resupply. So if in my case, I was a northbound hiker, if I wanted information on the next water supplies available, I'd see southbound hikers come through, and you'd always stop and visit and exchange information about where there are all you could eat restaurants up the way. But the first question was, where will I be able to refill my water bottles? And the springs were the best for that. Now, every once in a while, there'd be a road crossing in a store, and you could get actual store-bought water that way, or other treats, but the springs were the thing to rely on out there. This is Cooper Brook Falls in Maine, and high in the mountains and tumbling as this was, that was probably safe to drink from. But if it gets to be a larger stream and begins to meander like this one in Virginia, chances are it's not safe to drink from anymore. But a stream like this can be very useful, especially when it tumbles into a waterfall like this one at Laurel Gorge in Tennessee. I say useful because, hikers get pretty grungy out there in the woods, days at a time. You're slopping through wood or mud, you've got bugs, your sweat, your clothes are a mess. And everybody needs a shower along the way, lots of showers along the way. This is one where you can have one right out there in the woods. There are many nice ponds and lakes along the way. This is Dacey Pond at Baxter State Park. This is a view from my campsite that evening. But the largest lakes, well, you'll find lakes scattered and ponds scattered all along the way, but the largest ones, the ones we really call lakes, are in the state of Maine, which most hikers agree is the prettiest state on the trail. You don't want to call it really wilderness, but it's mostly owned by the timber companies, but you've got tens of thousands of acres of timbered ground and not that much civilization. I think in 350 miles, I crossed just a handful of paved roads. There were other old logging roads and gravel roads, but you don't see a lot of civilization generally through the state of Maine, and having the fall colors at that time makes it that much more scenic. And that's part of the aesthetic of hiking from south to north. You hike with the seasons. You start in the springtime. I started late. I started on May 19th because I didn't realize there was going to be a weather deadline in the north. Most people will start in April. Some will start in March, or I've seen them start in February when snow is on the ground down in the south. But you hike, you have the wildflowers in the spring in the southern Appalachians. You got basically good weather in midsummer through the middle Atlantic states, and hopefully you'll have those nice fall colors in New England. And the whole idea is to get there before you see snow up on Mount Katahdin, or you might not be able to finish the trip even once you've gotten up there. Well, as nice as the lakeside views were, it's still the mountaintop views that are the really big attraction on this trail. People do come from literally all over the world to hike this trail. And it is a great feeling to spend a half a day climbing to the top of a 4,000 or 5,000 foot mountain, and then stand up there or sit up there and let the wind blow through your hair and look at the world spread out beneath you. It's a very exhilarating feeling. And it doesn't even have to be a big mountain. It's just an accomplishment every time you get to the top of something. And you've all had that experience on mountains of this size, maybe larger or lesser, but it's still a great feeling to get to the top. And well, it doesn't matter whether you're looking out over the Georgia hills after the first mile of walking, or part of the Shenandoah Valley after nearly 1,000 miles of walking, or looking out over the North Woods of Maine after over 2,000 miles of walking. A person likes to get up on top and peek out over the edge to see what's down there. This is a place called Mcafee's Knob in Virginia, and it's, again, a place that hikers look forward to and enjoy while they're there. And you can do some pretty spectacular picture taking there. I wasn't going to sit out there or stand on that, but I crawled out there anyway. When you're up there on high, you look down into the valleys, you'll see some farms down there, some little cars and little trucks on little roads. And now and again, you'll drop down and get a closer look at these things. Today, the trail is entirely protected. It's public lands. I can't remember the width of the corridor, whether it's a half a mile, but on either side of the trail, you're going to have woods, and you're not going to see usually a whole lot of civilization. When I hiked the trail in 1980, there was only something like half of the trail that was protected at that time. The rest of it went through private land with the agreement of the landowners. And it was always a potential problem walking through farmers' fields, and there's a bull out there, that kind of thing. But more of a problem was, if it's not in public hands, somebody could put up apartment buildings across the trail, or if a farmer were mad at the hikers for some reason, they left a gate open, he'd shut down his section of trail. And for the future, they didn't want that to just continue on. So there's a huge land acquisition project that took place in the 1980s and into the early 90s. And now it's entirely protected. Now you will still go past farmers' fields and pastures. Occasionally you will walk past farmhouses out there in the hills. The people were friendly, and that may not be quite so true anymore, because with the increase in the numbers of hikers, they're not probably as glad to see all these people coming through as they were when I came through, when there were just a few of us. It was the little kids and the old people that were the friendliest. The little kids that come running out to offer water, and the old gentlemen would kind of sit on their porches waiting for a hiker to come by to visit with. And I always stopped and visited with them, and always found it a good time. They'd tell me all kinds of stories, none of which could possibly be true, but I always liked hearing their stories. And the one I heard more often than any other was, they'd point up to the hill, and they'd say they heard there were more rattlesnakes on that hill than on any other hill on the Appalachian Trail. He might have been right, don't know. Excuse me. Well, I was treated pretty well by people along the way. Got a lot of help. And this is a family in Pennsylvania that invited me in for a couple of days and fed me up and sent me on my way. And it was typical of the hospitality that I encountered in my day. But I should point out, in fairness, that these were relatives of mine. They had to take me in whether they liked me or not. But look at that house. What a great house. It was on my mother's side of the family. And they had a spring house for their drinking water. And it wasn't until about the year 2000 that they actually had indoor plumbing. Pardon me, I got a tickle in my throat. I got to drink something here. And cough. There, maybe I'm back. All right, anyway, that was in the hills of Pennsylvania, but I found that hospitality lots of places. Well, the trail does try to avoid civilization, but there are a dozen or so small towns that the trail goes right through or very near. This is the first of those so-called trail towns, Hot Springs, North Carolina. And you can see a hiker coming right down the main street past what was then the Trail Cafe. Well, you can imagine you're out there in the woods for weeks, months at a time. Little civilization stops like this are wonderful for hikers. This is where you can resupply with food, do your laundry, eat an actual meal in a restaurant or a diner. If you want to sleep in a bed, there might be a motel. There are bed and breakfasts along the way. There are also hikers' hostels where you can stay pretty cheaply. Anyway, the hikers really look forward to those things. And sometimes the towns look forward to the hikers as well. They would provide a place where the hikers could spend the night or two very inexpensively. I think I got my voice and my nose and everything back together again. This is a place called, well, it's called The Place at Damascus, Virginia, which has long called itself the friendliest town on the AT, and I have no reason to dispute that at all. And that year, well, you could stay at one of these hikers hostels, leave a little donation, whatever you could, but it was a place where it worked out well for the towns because it was a place where the hikers could all gather instead of trying to camp in people's backyards all around town. It was great for hikers because you could put up your feet and rest a while. And that's something you need to do once in a while. Even I've taken a lot of these hiking, biking, and canoeing long distance trips in this country and in Britain. And about once a week, you really need to take a day off. One, to rest your body and eat well. That's a good thing. Treat yourself to a few things. But you've also got these housekeeping chores. You got some laundry. You've got emails to respond to. You've got phone calls to make. You got, just things that you'd have to do, whether you were home or on a trip like this. So putting your feet up and resting once in a while is, I think, a pretty good thing to do. Well, you develop remarkable food cravings in the course of this hike. You're burning up thousands of calories a day. And I know my first food craving was for a peanut butter sandwich, of all things. And I was dumbfounded. I got to a road, I guess I'm not done with my throat. I got to a road crossing and there was a trail angel, as we call them, parked at the side of the road offering hikers who came through, guess what? Peanut butter sandwiches. So that was great. But the cravings could be for ice cream or chocolate milk, soda pop, Twinkies, you name it. You've got this incredible appetite. And you have an option every time you come to a road crossing. There's usually a road crossing at least once a day. You can hitchhike or walk to the nearest town to satisfy those cravings or resupply with groceries. But sometimes those towns might be 20 or 25 miles away and really hard to get to and from. So it was great when there was a store up there in the hills, very near the road crossing. This is one of those. Really wasn't up in the hills. It was down along the near the French Broad River or the James River, can't remember. Snowden, Virginia. That's where it's, pardon me again. What do I say? This Williams store was like an oasis in the desert for hikers. You walk in, drop down $15 or $20 on junk food and sit there and eat it on the spot and think you're in heaven for a little bit. Williams store is pretty typical. It was a town grocery store. It was a town liquor store. It was the post office. It was the gas station, the meeting hall. It was the whole business for Snowden, Virginia. And that store closed probably 30 years ago. And even at the time, there were only 2 or 3 houses in Snowden, Virginia. I don't know if those are still there or not. Well, sometimes you'll have actual mileage signs at road crossings. These are for the benefit usually of the people, in this case, in the Smokies, who want to hike in a short distance. They can drive up to the trail, park, and walk to whatever it is they want to see. And at Newfound Gap, this was the sign that made me start thinking about this trail. My parents were in Florida the winter of 79, 80, and I drove down to see them. And I went by way of the Great Smokies. I'd seen them as a kid, and I was super impressed as a kid. But when you're a little kid, you know, everything is big and impressive. When I drove through there as an adult and I looked at those mountains the same way, oh man, these are something. Well, at Newfound Gap, there was this sign saying where the Appalachian Trail cut through. And at that time, it said 2 miles to the Boulevard Trail, 3 miles to Icewater Springs, 3 miles to the jump off, 4 miles to Charlie's Bunion, where the picture was earlier, and a mere 1,823 miles on to the end of the trail at Mount Katahdin at that time. Well, that sign has been replaced many times through the years. Last time I was through there, look what they've done to the mileages. It was now not 1,873 miles or whatever, but 1,972 miles on to Mount Katahdin in Maine. So one more reason I'm glad I hiked the trail when I did. As far as I was working a pretty good job back in 1980. I had some money in my pocket, and I knew I didn't want to work that job forever. I wanted to go do something special, and I didn't know what that would be, but Newfound Gap and the signs there made me start thinking about it. And as I contemplated, I was helped by my customers along the way in making my decision. I'd walk into their offices and they'd say, John, why don't you go take a hike? And, enough of them said that I took their advice. I took that hike. Well, when you reach Mount Washington in the White Mountains of Vermont, White Mountains of New Hampshire, Mount Washington was the mountain we saw the view from earlier. You'll get a sign like this. It says, stop. The area ahead has the worst weather in America. Many have died there from exposure, even in the summer. Turn back now if the weather is bad. Well, the weather is frequently bad through there, and they're not kidding about it. It's in an area where their weather fronts typically collide, and the winds accelerate to get up over the mountains, and it can blow in storms and blow out storms at the drop of a hat. And you hear a lot of stories. One I heard was of a couple of young guys in their 20s who were in pretty good shape. Well, they were in their 20s, so they were in good shape. Thought they knew the mountains pretty well. They headed up Mount Washington on a sunny summer, July 16th in short sleeve weather. And guess what? They froze to death in an ice storm later that day. So things can happen. And part of the reason things can happen to hikers there is that Mount Washington, which looks pretty tame, I'll admit, in the picture, you'll have a 14-mile stretch over Mount Washington where you're continuously above tree line. And so if a storm blows in, you're kind of going to be exposed to it. And I don't know if they still do, but at the time when I went through, they still had crosses stuck in the rocks here and there where hikers had spent their last miserable moments. Over 100 people have died climbing over Mount Washington because the weather is so changeable and can be brutal. Highest recorded winds in the world atop Mount Washington at 231 miles per hour. And 1 out of every 3 days, the winds exceed 80 miles per hour. So you're going to have winds and you're going to have storms. And I just got lucky when I went through. Well, there are other things you'll be warned about. In North Carolina, you'll walk through a bear sanctuary. Makes you kind of think. In the Smokies, we were assured by rangers that we didn't have to worry about dangerous bears approaching us, because they said anytime they get a report of a bear that's threatening people or what have you, they live trap it and haul it off into the backcountry. And that's really great until you realize where the trail is. It's in the backcountry. But the most interesting wildlife that I encountered in the course of this hike were the other hikers. And I want to tell you about some of these people that I met. They'd be typical of the ones you'd meet today. All kinds, of course. These two were a couple of young fellas. They'd gone to University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and were hiking the trail together. I joined them in the Smokies. We hiked together for about a week, and they did not make it to Maine. And in fact, in those days, only about 1 out of every 20 hikers who started in Georgia actually succeeds in reaching the state of Maine. The completion rates are higher now. But there's still factors that cause people to leave the trail. There are more amenities now that makes life a little bit easier for hikers. And there are more of these trail angels waiting at crossroads to give them food and that sort of thing. More places to stay the night. But still, there's attrition along the trail. People can have an illness or an accident, an injury. They can run out of money. They can run out of time. Some people just get sick of the trail. The reason these two guys didn't make it, they got sick of each other. They thought they knew each other in college, but it wasn't working out. One liked to get up early, the other one liked to sleep in, one liked to hike quickly and get his day done quickly. The other one liked to kind of mosey along and see things. And I talked to one of these guys years later, and he said, yep, that's why we didn't make it. We just couldn't get along together. This fella did make it. His name is Rob Goodwin. He just graduated from the University of Connecticut when he started this trip. And I took this picture of him. He was about halfway up the trail, about 1,000 miles up, stopped at a little country grocery store in Pennsylvania. And Rob was what we termed by then animalized. And you'll see what I mean when you take a closer look at him. He hasn't had a haircut since the start of the trail, hasn't shaved his beard since the start of the trail. His shirt is completely filthy. His legs are scarred with briars. And even if you could take a bath or a shower someplace, that towel of his draped over that red pack on the left wouldn't help him out a whole lot. It's filthy too. And more than anything else, that is life on the Appalachian Trail or Appalachian Trail, however you pronounce it. If you're going to live in the woods for months at a time, you're going to have to become animalized at some point. And you don't offend the other hikers. They're all in the same boat. They understand that when you reach civilization, a trail town or what have you, you'll take a bath or a shower and launder your clothes. But yeah, you're going to have to become animalized and learn to live with the bugs and the mud and the rains and the sweat, hot days, cold days, all of that takes, yeah, a lot of wear and tear on you. And I should mention, about a year ago, I visited Rob in Connecticut the year after the trail. I drove out east and visited a lot of people I'd met the previous year, and enjoyed stopping in at his place, Glastonbury, Connecticut. And last year I was just wondering, whatever became of Rob Goodwin. So I went to the web and put in Rob Goodwin, Connecticut, and he died of cancer just 2 months before that. So I hate that. I want to ban death and dying. I'm really sick of it. This is a guy who made it the whole way. His name was Bob Johnston, and he was one of the older hikers on the trail. Most of the hikers are young, just out of high school or college, who haven't gotten involved in a career yet. Others are the other end, the retirement age. People have been planning this trip for a long, long time, like Bob Johnston, and he finally had the time to get out and do some hiking. There are some numbers that they give on the upper ages for completing this trail. And there have been a couple of people in their 80s. One person was legally blind and completed the trail. And some of these kind of border on legends. You wonder if they're really true. There was a gal named Granny Gatewood who is said to have hiked the trail twice, the last time in when she was 86. But it's also been discovered that there are people along the way who acknowledge giving her rides along the way. So she may not have been quite not the same person she was portrayed as. But she became a darling of the press when they asked her, well, what parts of the trail do you like the most? And she said, I like the downhill parts. Well, yeah. And that's also a clue that maybe she didn't do the whole thing, because backpackers will tell you it's what really wears and tears is the downhill part. That's what really puts stress on your knees and your ankles and so on. The going up, it's hard, but you move at your own pace. When you're coming downhill, you've got gravity with you and you can get moving too fast and fall. And that's where problems come in on the downhills. I don't know how they handle it today, but when I hiked, there were a lot of people who brought dogs along, and they're technically illegal in the national parks. I think maybe the national forest too. And I don't know how they get around that. Well, I think they just sneak through is what they do. But still, it seemed like a nice idea to bring along man's best friend on a hike like this. Usually the dog has to carry his own supplies in a doggy pack on his back. And when you see an arrangement like this, where the dog's owner is carrying the dog's supplies for him, you know very quickly which is the smarter of the two, and of which you should be asking directions. There was a guy in Georgia, wasn't this guy, some guy in Georgia I met one day hiking with his dog, and he was carrying a 20-pound sack of dog food for his dog. And I thought, oh my gosh, on top of everything else that he was carrying, couldn't the dog carry a little bit of that for him? As they were saying 40 years ago and still say today, there are increasing numbers of women hiking the trail, and it's still true, but still the large majority who hike it are men. These are a couple of women I met in Georgia one day. They weren't planning to go the whole way. They were just going to hike through Georgia. But the one crouched down by the tree exemplifies some of the tenacity that hikers bring to the trail. These two had planned their trip for quite a while, saved money, bought supplies, and the day before starting the hike, the gal by the tree here set her pack fully loaded out on her porch, went back inside for a few minutes, and when she came back out, somebody lifted the pack and stolen everything. Which, by the way, is something you have to be cautious about when you stop at those little stores in these small towns along the way. Put your pack in a place that's where you can keep an eye on it, because there are always people out there. It's one of the safest stretches of 2,000 miles anywhere, but there are always people who are willing to take something for free if you leave it out there. Anyway, she was not going to be discouraged. She got on the phone, called friends, borrowed money, borrowed equipment, hit the trail on schedule the next day. So you got to really want to be out there, and they were. These two are a couple that I spent a lot of time with. In fact, the guy on the right from Massachusetts was the guy I hiked with more than anyone else. Mine was a solo trip. I went out there on my own. But what you discover, the social aspect of this trail, it's like a moving community. The vast majority of the people would be moving south to north. And the people who start out a week ahead of you, if you hike quickly and they go slowly, you'll catch up to them and meet them. And if you go slowly, the people who start a few days behind you will catch up and you'll meet them. So you meet this broad swath of people that's all gradually moving up the trail. And sometimes you'll read their names in trail registers at shelters and not meet them for weeks and weeks or months. And then one day one night you're camped with them, and it's like you're old friends because you've heard their name a million times, and suddenly they're there. Well, there are trail names, and that's kind of a big thing on the trail. It's like CD handles like truckers used to have back in the 70s or whenever. The guy on the left there called himself Bad Knee Bill. On the days when his knee didn't hurt so bad, he called himself Not So Bad Knee Bill. That was Woodsy George on the right. And sometimes he smelled a little too woodsy, but he couldn't help it. He's out there on the trail. A lot of names, some pretty ordinary, like the Tramper or the Shamrock or the Pilgrim. Then you get some of the weird names, Captain America, the Wandering Aardvark, odd names. There was a married couple a few years back. They called themselves the Thing with Two Heads. So there were groups. These were all people who started off individually. They were all from suburbs of Atlanta and formed up and became the Georgia Express. I also met the South Georgia Possums, the Hancock Hobos, the Strohs Brothers, and the Slow Motion Boogeymen were out there too. A lot of trail names. That's just part of the trail life. This is a family, or it's what's left of the Mccoys after the Hatfields were done with them. But these are the real Mccoys. They were from Ohio. And when they started the trail, the wife and daughter had been with these two. But when September rolled around, the wife had to go back to teach school and the daughter had to go back to school. But the men folks solved that problem pretty neatly. Mr. Mccoy quit his job to stay on the trail. And the boy said he never liked school all that much anyway. And this is one of those, it's an old program. So there are things that are dated. They're wearing blue jeans. You never see blue jeans out on the trail. Now they've got these lightweight synthetics is what people would wear, and they get wet and they dry out. Blue jeans, you know what that's like. But that's what everybody had in those days. Anyway, yeah, families are out there on the trail. These are some special people that I met one day on a hot day in Virginia, then camped with them one night in the state of Maine. well, I should point out the guy on the left. That was me in my animalized condition. That was the best I could look at that time. Changed a little, huh? The little boy and the woman there, they were two of the Cogswells. The husband, Jeff Cogswell, was taking the picture. Little Michael became a trail celebrity that year. He became the youngest person to hike the trail from end to end in a single hiking season. He was 6 years old. His record, by the way, has since been broken by, I think it was a girl who was just a little bit younger. Anyway, it's a tough challenge for an adult, but you put little 6-year-old legs to work out there, and they've got a lot of work to do. And actually, the Cogswells, I thought they were really nice people, but they became controversial because some people thought it was child abuse to have Michael out there hiking, and they were going to write a book about it, and they were keeping track of the number of times Michael fell. I should say everybody slips and falls once in a while. You pick yourself up and you continue. By the time they'd gone halfway, little Michael had fallen 632 times. But even though it looks like he's sobbing at trailside, and I'm sure there were times he did, when I met him that day, he was having a blast. When I camped with him in Maine, he was having a blast. It looked like a great experience. Now, this is a genuine trail celebrity. His name, oh gosh, what is his name? Earl Schaefer is his name. Gosh, how did that slip away all of it? Earl Schaefer. Earl Schaefer was the very first person to complete the Appalachian Trail in a single hiking season. He did it in 1947. He was just fresh out of the Marines from World War II, in great shape. He started with a friend, and the friend bailed out along the way, but Earl continued on. And I wouldn't have known him. I knew the name because hikers talk about the legends of the trail. But he was with a volunteer work party clearing brush along the trail near Allentown, Pennsylvania that day. And one of the other guys working with him pointed him out. That's Earl Schaefer. And it was great to talk to him. And he told me a few things about his trip. He said he mainly hiked at night to avoid the heat. And he didn't wear boots. He wore Indian moccasins so he could feel the trail under his feet. Well, I felt the trail under my feet. I'm not sure how good an idea that is, but that's how he did it. He was a very unique individual. He was a poet, a free thinker. He was his own man. And not only did he become the first person to hike it entirely in a single season, south to north, he later returned to the trail and became the first person to have hiked it in both directions. And then 50 years after his initial hike in 1947, he returned to the trail and completed it again. And what his age was at that time, I'm not sure, but he is a trail legend, and he's in the great trail up in the clouds now, but it was an honor to meet him that day. This too is a kind of a trail celebrity. His name is Warren Doyle, Dr. Warren Doyle. He could be called Mr. Appalachian Trail because he's hiked it so many times. I've actually lost count. I think if there's a Wikipedia entry that I think it's something like 17 times now that he's hiked the trail, but he used to do it every year and lead a group each year. And he was known for his long walking days. He carried nothing but peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And when he first hiked it in 1973, he set what was then the land speed record. Officially, there are no records for these things, but unofficially, everybody knows what the records are and who did it. And he did it in 73 days. I did it in 140 days, but he had a little advantage over me. He wasn't, well, his father was driving parallel to him with a support vehicle, and he'd meet Warren at road crossings and give him just enough food or equipment to get to the next road. So he was doing 40 miles a day often, and he did it by not carrying a full pack. And if you've met him, you'll understand that sometimes he's not carrying a full deck either. Now, I shouldn't say that. He's been good to me. I haven't seen him now in years, but I run into him 2 or 3 different places aside from the trail. So he's still actively doing something, but whether he's still doing the trail, don't know. But if he looks a little bit goofy, well, you would too with 40 or 50,000 trail miles under your belt, man. Now talk about trail dazed or animalized. This is me again, wildly celebrating my 100th night on the trail. And if you wonder how a person celebrates 100 nights on the trail, well, I've been carrying a little piece of dried pineapple that I bought at a store in New Jersey. I carried it about, I don't know, 300 miles or so. And that night in Vermont, I figured I'd eat that piece of pineapple. It sure was good. Yep, these are high times on the Appalachian Trail. And you may wonder, well, where do people spend the night? You're up in the woods and the mountains. And I don't need to tell any of you who have camped out in the woods anywhere that there are a lot of sounds, strange sounds that go on in the nighttime woods when you're camped. So you rarely get what I'd call a good continuous night's sleep. You're kind of half awake, half asleep, waiting to be eaten alive by something. You don't know what, but you can hear it crunching twigs all around your tent all night. But anyway, you are in the woods and the mountains, and anyone who hikes it today will need a tent for sure. And tents are nice. They give you a lot of flexibility. You can set them up about anywhere you want to spend the night. But they carry a weight factor, and I wanted to go as lightly as I could, so I didn't carry a tent. I just carried a nylon tarp, and this was not my tarp. It was somebody else who was using a tarp. I took a picture of it on the morning after a big rainfall. Probably had water flowing under the tent at that point. But yeah, that was a handy way to make it work. And the other thing that I did was I relied upon the shelters. Now they have shelters, Adirondack style shelters, roughly every 10 miles along the trail. And now you can't count on that. Sometimes it's 5 miles, it might be 20 miles. But when you get to a shelter at night, that's a good place, or used to be, because it would give you a roof over your head, a board floor to sleep upon. There was a water source nearby for cooking and washing up. But they only could hold, say, 6 or 8 people. And hikers would always make room for somebody who came in late. Yeah, we'll move some things aside and fit you in here, especially if it's raining. But now, with the kind of numbers that they have on the trail, you could not count on shelters. Sometimes I had shelters to myself. That was great. But you'd never see that today. And this particular style of shelter, it looks like sort of a log cabin. That's an old primitive style that they used early on, and almost all those places have been replaced by more modern looking versions of the same Adirondack style. And even then, when I hiked it, there were some of these places that weren't all that great. The roofs might leak. There might not be a board floor. You'd have to sleep in the dirt. There might not be a water source, or maybe there was in the spring, but by autumn that's dried up. But one thing you could count on at all shelters, good or bad, was mice. They were just alive with mice. And it took a couple of weeks of getting used to learn to fall asleep with mice cavorting around all over at night. What they wanted to get to the food in your pack, so you'd have to hang your pack from a hook on the ceiling. And even then, they could be very acrobatic little devils and get into almost anything. I never really approved of it, but there were people who made great sport of carrying mouse traps and killing mice along the way. I suppose that did everybody a favor, but I always felt bad for the mice. Oh, there are other more interesting critters coming in at night than mice. In the South, I had skunks in camp on 2 occasions, and one of them literally walked over my sleeping bag one night, and you lay there very quietly and still when a skunk is walking over your sleeping bag. I had no mishaps, but I did hear the story, and well, a true story of a guy who was camped with his dog in a shelter one night. When a skunk wandered in, the dog started barking heroically. That woke up the guy who stuck his head out of the sleeping bag to see what all this commotion was about. That's right when the skunk sprayed him in the face. And they tell me that was the last night he chose to spend on the AT for some reason. A lot of reasons for leaving the trail sometimes. In the middle Atlantic states, I had more raccoons than anything else. And I've always been a big fan of raccoons. I've raised one once, and I just think they're terrific animals. So I didn't mind raccoons coming around. More power to the raccoons. In New England, it was porcupines that you'd be dealing with. And yeah, they were looking for food, but they were also looking for salt. You know, all these, we came from the sea originally. We part of us was made of salt and we need salt. So deer and buffalo would go to salt licks in the woods. Well, where porcupines could find salt was on the edges of the shelters, where sweaty hikers would come in the course of the day and sit down and rest, and sweat would seep into the floorboards. And those hikers would leave and move on, but they'd leave these salt deposits behind, and the porcupines were coming in gnawing at night. And it sounds like a machine gun going off, just 6 feet away from you when a porcupine comes in. No real mishaps there, but one day, for me anyway, but one day from some distance in Vermont or Massachusetts, there was a guy hiking with his dog coming from the other direction, and he called out, "Do you have any tweezers?" And no, I didn't have any tweezers. What did he need tweezers for? Well, when they got closer, I could see that the dog's snout was bristling with quills. And that's just one more reason it's probably a good idea to leave the dog at home. A dog from Illinois has never seen or heard of a porcupine before. He thinks it's just one more thing to chase. And that one found out very painfully, if not fatally, that porcupines aren't to be messed with in that way. When I did the trail through the Smokies, they had shelters with steel fences in front of them. So you could lock yourself into the shelters at night and be safe from the bears. But you did feel a little silly locked into these cages in the woods at night while the bears come out and look at you like you're in the zoo. They have removed the fencing, and I think part of it had to do with an accident, an electrical storm that went through the Smokies in the late 80s. Lightning struck one of these shelters, and the metal, there was wiring in the bunks that people were sleeping in, kind of wire mesh that they were sleeping on, and there was metal roof and all this. Well, 5 or 6 people got electrocuted, and so they've been removing those, and apparently there's not a real bear threat. They're not going to come in and eat you anyway, so but you won't see those now. If it was a nice night, you could camp out under the stars. I did that frequently. On this particular night, I camped in that grassy patch on Mount Cube in New Hampshire. That's Mount Moosilauke in the distance. This is a good place to camp, so long as you're not prone to sleepwalking or, say, rolling over in the night. Yeah, there's Mount Moosilauke off in the distance over here. If you wonder how far a person would go in a day, about as far as you could see from one mountaintop to the other. It was exactly 20 miles from the top of Mount Cube to the top of Mount Moosilauke, and I would go 22 the next day to a shelter 2 miles down the other side. That night, there was a nice sunset at my back as I went to sleep, and the next morning, another nice sunrise creeping up over the eastern ridge. Again, those are clouds in the valley, and that was one of the neat things about being up on the ridge lines early in the morning. You'd see these clouds flowing like rivers through those valleys, and of course, later in the day, those would burn away. Well, you might spend your night any number of places, but when I did it, hikers generally gathered at the shelters. That was our accommodation. Some people did carry tents when they had to have them, but at that time, you could pretty well count on some shelter space. And the first order of business getting into a camp was to get something to eat. You spend the greater part of your hiking life starved to death. Of course, you're happy to take that heavy pack off your back at the end of the day, but then the eating is the first priority. And this is what a meal might look like. In this case, it's freeze-dried chicken stew. And I acknowledge it doesn't look like much, but if you add some boiling water and some imagination, you get something that looks and tastes a lot like freeze-dried stew. But it's great. Your body appreciates anything. Yeah, there's your freeze-dried chicken stew and real stew. And by the way, you're so hungry, if one of those little peas or piece of corn or potato or something ends up on the ground, it doesn't end up on the ground. It's back in your mouth as fast as you can get it there. You don't waste anything. And then once you've had that evening meal, then it's time to sit around and enjoy the company of the other hikers around a campfire, trading trail stories. Friendships grow very quickly on the trail because you have so many experiences in common. You've been hiking the same trail, the same mountain, stopping in the same towns. You've been meeting some of the same fellow hikers, enduring some of the same difficulties. When the storm went through, everybody got soaked on a given day. And it wasn't uncommon at all to sit up half the night trading trail stories with somebody you just met that evening at the shelter. So I didn't realize the social aspect of the trail. Now that's maybe the number one selling point. When I did it, it was a place to take a walk in the wilderness. Now it's more of a social thing, which is a little bit of a problem, because if it becomes known more as a social thing than this, nature, get away from it all type hike, then it attracts a little bit different characters. And they've had problems with alcohol in some of the parks where the hikers bring it in, cannabis and the whole business. But yeah, I think that's become a bigger part of the trail now than it was when I was there. Well, sometimes you felt like you're leaving some of your best friends behind the next morning, but that's part of the tyranny of the trail. You can't linger behind just because you met some people you liked the night before. You've got to keep moving on, or you will not make it to the big K, Mount Katahdin, before the snows. And that's the one thing you've got to do. I meant to tell you in that earlier picture, I mentioned Doug Woodsy George and Bad Knee Bill. Woodsy George was one who, I met him one day in Southern Virginia. We hiked together for about 300 miles. I took time off to visit a friend at Charlottesville. He went on ahead. I didn't catch up to him again until one day in New York. We hiked together to his hometown of Dalton, Massachusetts, where he took time off to visit his family. I went on ahead and he didn't catch up, but I stayed in touch with him, as I have with a lot of these hikers. And that year, he became one of those unfortunate hikers who hiked all the way up to Mount Katahdin. The winter snows rolled in. He camped for 3 days to see if the weather would get better, but it got worse. The rangers wouldn't let him up the side of the mountain. And to make a long story short, that summer he hiked 2,100 miles and fell 5.2 miles short of completing the trail. Kind of a bummer. He returned the next year to complete it. But these things happen if you don't keep moving along. So that's what the hikers do. Mile after mile, step after step, ever northward or ever southward if you're going the other direction. Through some of the most beautiful countryside in all of North America. Yeah, I'll give it to the Rockies for being, rocky and jagged and high and very impressive. But the Appalachians have their own special appeal. There's a charm there, definitely. So you'll walk along the ridge lines of the East Coast, through the mountain meadows, through the woods. To grandmother's house we go, across the streams, across rivers, and you'll do it in all kinds of weather. And along the way, everyone becomes a philosopher. Every hiker realizes he's not just hiking the mountains of the East Coast, he's hiking the mountains within himself. And it's true that those hikers who accept the challenges of this trail day in and day out, give it their all each day, they're the ones that are going to enjoy the trail's rewards. About a day before you get to Mount Katahdin, you get a nice view of it. Katahdin is the highest mountain in Maine, about a mile high, and it stands up very majestically above the North Woods of Maine. It's a spectacular place for the trail to end up. Take a day or so to get to the foot of Mount Katahdin, where I camped at Katahdin Stream Campground, or at least passed by there. It says it's 5.2 miles to Baxter Peak. That's the high point of Katahdin and the end of the trail. They also give the mileage back to Georgia if you figure you can't make it on any farther. I figured I could. You'll pass by Katahdin Stream Falls, a beautiful waterfall there. And then you start following those white blazes up through the boulder country. And before long, you're above tree line again. No more trees, just rocks and mosses and clouds. Pretty soon you start looking down on those clouds. With a mile and a half to go, you reach what they call the gateway. It's kind of, mountain levels off into sort of a plateau. And I had seen it days before without realizing it, but it was finally here that the end of the trail really was in sight. I knew that was Baxter Peak, and you're pretty much on easy street that last mile and a half. They say spectacular scenery from Katahdin on a clear day. Didn't exactly have that. And the mist began to roll in over the mountain in the last mile, and a lot of thoughts go through your mind as you reach the last mile of a 2,000, in my case, 2,106 mile trek. And among those thoughts were, man, I'm glad I got here. I had an ankle that I had broken 2 or 3 times and had surgery on once. And people at the office said, "Oh, you won't even make it the first mile with that ankle." Well, I made it to the last mile. And if I broke my ankle, then I'd have crawled. Didn't have to crawl, didn't break it, made it to the top. And that's how I looked. Pretty much everyone looks that way when they reach Baxter Peak, but it's a very satisfying feeling to stand there and look around knowing what you just completed. In my case, 140 days of hiking. Looking around, this was the plateau area that I just come up from. To my left was more ridges and clouds, and directly behind me over those rocks was a 2,000-foot drop straight down, which I was informed would be the quick route down the mountain. But I'm a patient guy. I decided I'd walk back down the trail that day and camped at Dacey Pond. And the next morning, the clouds parted enough that I had a last look at Katahdin, and gave me a chance to reflect on the trip a little bit. And it was something I really, really enjoyed. And so because of this being this first big adventure, well, then I've done all the hiking, biking, and canoeing, 35,000-mile expedition miles or so of this stuff, and still enjoy it. And it's the sort of thing I hope all of you have or will have the opportunity to enjoy. And I'm not saying you need to hike the Appalachian Trail. You can find your own mountains to climb, but I can guarantee you won't regret it. You take off on one of these trips and successfully complete it. It's a great feeling, and you see America and you meet interesting people, beautiful scenery, and I do recommend it. So thank you. And I'm sorry we got a late start, so we've got a late finish, but that happened too, and we overcame that as well. Now, if Patty's out there,
yes,
got some
John,
questions.
that was a lovely overview. Please let me know how I can help. I see some questions.
If you could read those questions off to me, I'll answer them.
Very good. Cindy asks, shares, thank you, John, for sharing your experience and stories. I need Jan asked a question about the mosquitoes. Did the mosquitoes eat you up?
Generally not. Up on the ridge lines, that's not where the mosquitoes are. They're down where the water is, which is down over the sides of the mountains or at the foot of the mountains. And if you camp in low ground, you can have a bug problem. I think there was only one night, you're kind of on low ground, one night in New Jersey where I was badgered by mosquitoes. But generally up in the ridge lines, it just wasn't a problem. And that was a surprise to me, and a pleasant surprise that we just didn't have to deal with a bug problem very often up on the ridge lines. During the days, sometimes you get into a thicket that's green and wet, and you'll have some mosquitoes then in those situations. But generally speaking, mosquitoes weren't the big problem on that trail. And you got plenty of others to deal with, but not necessarily mosquitoes.
I don't necessarily see any other question. Oh, yeah, here we go. Did you lose a lot of weight?
Yeah, which would be a really good reason to go back out again. I lost, well, I was still a young man at that time, so I really hadn't put on very much. I was 29 when I did this. But I did lose weight. I mean, you become a walking machine. You're muscle and bone, and you're really good at walking, but you can't do anything else because the other muscles that you use for going up and down climbing into my cousin's truck, I got leg cramps and so forth because I just wasn't used to that kind of motion. But for walking, you're in great shape and you will lose weight. There was my last hiking companion was a retired guy from New Jersey. Gordon Gamble was his name, and he was a very small man to begin with. I think he only weighed something like 130 pounds to begin with, but he lost 20 along the way. And there was a gal, I shouldn't mention her name, from Barrington, Illinois, who lost 40 pounds or 50 pounds on the course of that walk. Yeah, you'll burn up tons of calories, and you just can't eat enough to stay up with that. But it does, a lot of that flab turns to muscle, and a lot of it just disappears. So yeah, you'll lose weight in the course of that. It's a whole lot of work, and it takes a while to get into shape so you can really enjoy the trail. It took me about a month starting out in Georgia, and I didn't do anything special to train for it. And some people do, and that gives them a little advantage. But the truth is, nobody's quite in shape for this trail, and everybody has to kind of walk himself into shape. And if you want to train for 3 or 4 months before that, well, as I've always said, you're in for 4.5 or 5 months of hard work when you hit the trail. If you want to add another 3 or 4 or 5 months of training beforehand, you're welcome to it. But yeah, it took about a month to get into cruising condition. And once you get to that point, then it's good to stay with it and ride it out from there. And that's a drawback for people who go out, say, once a summer to do a different segment of the trail. They have to beat themselves into shape again each time. But they will lose weight there too.
We have 4 questions that popped up, so I'll run through them.
Okay.
How do you handle the bathroom situation? Do you need permits related to camping? And how much money did you bring? And then I have a complicated question. So
Okay.
bathroom, permits, money.
Well, I could complicate almost all of those. I didn't use a bathroom. I held it for 2,000 miles. No, at the shelters, there's usually a privy that people can use, environmental friendly privies now, but still privies. Where there are road crossings, once in a while there'll be a roadside rest, or there's a gas station or some place that you can use. Other times you're out on your own, and that's why you're supposed to take a spade along so you can dig a little hole. And that's another reason why the trail needs to be rerouted once in a while. There was a place, it was a beautiful view from this ridge in North Carolina, but I had to go pretty bad. I went back behind these bushes, and what I saw was a row of toilet paper about 50 yards long, where everybody had used that as a bathrooming area. And that's kind of nauseating. But that, it's life. All right, second question. What was it? Was it the money one?
Can you camp? And if you do you need permits?
Well, you can camp just about anywhere, but they try to minimize the impact by keeping hikers near the shelters, even if they're tenting. And if you do need to have permits when you go into the national parks. There's a gate at Shenandoah National Park where you'll sign in, and you need a permit to go through there. And I don't think you really have to plan out and tell them where you're going to be from night to night, because you really don't know on a hiking trip. You can turn your ankle on a given day and you won't get as far as you think. There is some permitting. I couldn't name all the places, but I know that the national parks do, and maybe the national forests. I'm just not sure. Maybe somebody who's been out there more recently could answer part of that. But the camping, people can do just about anywhere. But maybe in the national parks, you need to be in certain places to minimize the impact.
Okay, how much money did you bring with you?
How much money did I bring? Well, it was a different era. Now when people hike the trail, they've all got cell phones and they get reception from the tops of mountains, and they're maintaining a blog in camp every night. And in a lot of ways, it's a different trail than I did. When it came to money, we're talking $1980, so this would change a whole lot. But it cost me about $1 a mile is what I figured. Now you probably have to figure, $5 a mile or $6 a mile. But I reckon it cost me about $2,000. And it's just like real life. If you have more money, you can have a better time. You can treat yourself better when you get to town to a meal, or stay in a bed and breakfast, and have a civilized stay over once in a while. If you haven't got much, then I remember a guy named Lauren Kearns from Texas. He was doing it on the cheap, as was Doug Woodsy George. And when they come to a town, they'd still be camped out in the woods. They couldn't really go have a meal or anything because they were tight on dollars. Well, it's the more you spend, probably the better time you have, but you can do it the cheap route too. And I don't have a good figure on how
No,
1980
I
all
think
costs.
that's good, John. I think you've given
Okay.
us a sense of it. Patsy has a question and some comments. Her comments is that this was better to watch than one of those Thor movies. So that's a compliment. You touched on this, but maybe you could fill us in a little more. Do cell phones work while hiking? And she also wants to know if there was a fee to cross the Kennebec River.
Kind of going backwards on that. I don't believe there is a fee, but perhaps there's a donation or something that you might be asked. I mean, it costs a guy some time and a little bit of gas with his motorboat, and they've got to pay for that somehow. There is an organization called the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, based at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and the trail goes right through there. That is kind of the overseeing body. They coordinate all these efforts along the trail. They're the ones that sell the maps and the guidebooks. And I'm trying to think of why I'm getting into this. What was that last question again?
She wants to know about the cell phones, and she wants to know if there's a fee.
Yeah. Well, I just theorized there might be a donation, but not a fee on the Kennebec River. And it wouldn't be much, even if there is a fee. As far as cell phones, yeah, from the ridge lines and the tops of the mountains, you'll usually have reception, and at the very least, you'll be able to send a text message. Down in the valleys, I guess it depends on cell tower locations, whether you can, when you're deep in the woods in the valleys, whether you can actually get cell service or not. You may have to wait till you get up on top someplace. And that also changes, say, the safety matters along the trail. When I did it, there were no cell phones, and you were really out on your own. And if somebody broke a leg, they were going to lay there on the trail until some other hiker came through, and somebody would have to go to the nearest town and report it. And most of these little towns would have a mountain rescue squad, sort of like a volunteer fire department. And I saw them pull off a hiker off of Pleasant Pond Mountain in Maine. And they were like World War I veterans. And I thought they all had to be hauled off before they could haul off the other person. But today, somebody makes a phone call and shortcuts all that. So it changes things. Honestly, some of these changes I wouldn't care for. The last thing I'd want to do in evening camp is to work on my blog for the day. No, you want to get something to eat and go to bed and start it again the next day. But that's part of the modern life of the trail. People are staying electronically connected, and which sort of defeats the purpose almost to me.
I have a few more questions, but I'll tell you that I put my librarian hat on and I checked the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And there is no charge for the ferry if you do it under their normal hours and normal season. And they do have a nice page with information about that.
And, you know, I think I have something just happens. I have their website. Yeah. So
Excellent.
Anybody who wants detailed information on the trail or non-detailed info, it is the Appalachian Trail Conservancy that can help you out. And there's their phone number and the web address. And that's a good organization. And yeah, well, that's good to know they don't charge. I didn't think they did charge because they're wanting to encourage people to take that rather than waiting the Kennebec. So if you charge even $1, there'll be people who will do everything they can to avoid that $1. So.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So Jeanette wants to know, even today, do you have any souvenirs from your trip on your feet? I think she's wondering how your feet have survived, if you had any permanent damage.
No, feet were fine, but it did take 6 weeks for the stone bruising to leave my feet. But they've been fine ever since. Yeah, there was no recurrence of that. But if I went out and did the trail the same way, I'd probably experience that again too.
Sonia asks, how did you return home?
Oh, how did I return home? Well, it was kind of a convoluted thing. Originally, my dad took me down to Georgia, dropped me off where I started the trip. And then when I got to Maine, that last hiking companion, the guy from New Jersey, his wife was up to pick him up. But I only went as far as Bar Harbor, where I took the boat over to Nova Scotia because I wanted to see Nova Scotia. And I'd had this fantasy in the closing weeks of the trail that I'd really like to see the Bay of Fundy and sit in a cabin for about a week and not walk anywhere. And so I just went over there to Nova Scotia and I picked out this little village along the Bay of Fundy called Halls Harbor. There's one little store, Fred Parker's General Store. And he said, I've got a cabin right up here in the hill. You're welcome to it as long as you like. And so I spent a week watching the Bay of Fundy and the tides roll in and roll out, which was a neat thing. And I did some sightseeing, went to Montreal, eventually worked myself back to Pennsylvania to those relatives. And the boy in the picture was about my age. And he was driving a truck in those days and he had a load going to Illinois. And I became a part of that load back to Illinois. So getting back I actually took weeks to get back because there were things I wanted to see.
All right, our last question from Alex is curious about the camera you used to take all the photos. How much did that weigh?
How much did that what? How much that weigh? You know, I can't remember how much it weighed. It always felt like it weighed a whole lot more than it needed to. You know, cameras are pretty lightweight. Well, people are using their phones for the most part now, but that was a 35 millimeter Nikon of whatever style. And, you know, a rugged case. I did drop it once on a road in Tennessee and I left it behind on a rock in the Smokies and had to go 2 miles back to get it. Nobody had stolen it. But it was a good camera and I had never used a nice camera like that before I started this trip. And I wasn't even sure, you know, these were film days. I wasn't even sure I was loading the film properly, much less getting pictures. But so I didn't take that many pictures early on, but once I saw how they were coming out, then I started to buy more film and took a lot more pictures. But yeah, it was a Nikon and it weighed plenty. And on rainy days, you couldn't take it out. I mean, you had to keep it stored in a plastic bag in your pack where no water would get to it. And there were days you just couldn't even get a picture.
Yeah. And let me read you a few comments, John. People really enjoyed the program. Cindy says, thank you for sharing your experience and stories. Joanne says, thank you for sharing your story. You're a wonderful storyteller. And just generally, thanks so much for the travelogue. From Anonymous, couldn't have been 1980, seems like yesterday. Your reminiscence is a treasure. And are you ready for the Pacific Crest?
No, I'm not ready for the Pacific Crest. I'm not a glutton for punishment. I thought about it at one time, but the next major trip after this was a canoe trip down the length of the Mississippi. And the next trip after that was a bike trip, Oregon Trail from Missouri out to Oregon and the Alaska Highway. And then I started doing things in Britain. And I just, yeah, I'm not really all that keen on backpacking at this age. Wasn't even keen on it when I was young. That's the only way to have some of these experiences. But I've had my experience on a long distance backpacking thing. I did walk the length of Great Britain. That was with a backpack too. Yeah, I think I've done enough of that. I did meet some hikers on the Continental Divide Trail a couple of years ago. I was on a bike trip across, where was it? Santa Fe, sorry, Flagstaff, Arizona to Albuquerque. And the Continental Divide cuts through there. And I saw some hikers at a little restaurant and I enjoyed talking with them. They were just the same kind of people that I met on the AT, same spirit, in for a big adventure, and they were still in the early stages. How many of those actually made it to Canada? I don't know, but that's a major adventure too. And I just don't think I'm going to be a part of that from here on, but you never know.
John, I'm gonna quote Jeanette, and maybe we'll wrap up. She says, "I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation and thank you."
Well, that's terrific. I appreciate the audience patience for sticking around, and sorry about the problems getting on late there, but we got on. So let's get on with our days and have a good weekend. And hate to see winter coming on.
Thank you very much, John. And as a reminder to everyone who attended today, we will finish up the recording process and have it available tomorrow, and I'll send you an email. And John, thank you very much for your time. I think the problems were beyond our control, so you did a very good job with that. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
All right.